And I believe the topic is quite interesting indeed, since the Russian military aggression, Russian invasion of Ukraine, this opens a new page in terms of international system, in terms of new norms, or whether this UN system, which was established right after the Second World War, is going to continue. I mean, this is a huge challenge indeed. It doesn't only affect Turkey, but Turkey definitely is one of the countries that was to be affected mostly. So probably that was the reason why, from the very beginning, it wanted to initiate such a mediating role. But at the end of the day, it wasn't possible to stop Russian aggression, and here we are. In order to understand how this current development is going to affect Turkey, Turkish foreign policy, Turkey's relations with Russia, and of course Turkey's relations with the West, referring to your question, whether this is Turkey's, I mean, this has been asked for a while, whether this is Turkey's pivoting to Asia from West. I would like to start with a very brief, I will use my time properly, hopefully, but I still need to focus a little bit on the background of Turkey-Russia relations in order to put it in a right way. So from the very early 2000s, actually, to the maybe later half of 2010s, I mostly see that the rapprochement with Moscow had been driven by a multidimensional foreign policy on Ankara's part mainly. That was looking for closer ties with Moscow as a balancing factor vis-a-vis the West, vis-a-vis the Western world. What I'm trying to say is that in the early 2000s, actually, Turkey was attempting to establish balanced, mostly complementary relations with both West and Russia in line with this multidimensionalism. Constructivist foreign policy, pragmatic foreign policy, those were the main natures of the Turkish foreign policy. However, there has been anti-Westernist sentiment as well later on accompanying this multidimensional foreign policy that brought Turkey and Russia together. I do remember in 2006, for the first time I saw the article written by Fiona Hill and Ömer Taşpınar, whether Russia-Turkey axis was the axis of excluded. So at the beginning, even though it started as a multidimensionalism, later on we have seen sometimes a sentiment of anti-Westernism as well. By the time passing, when I've said early 2000s, almost the later half of the 2010s, by the time passing, we have seen Turkey's relations with United States and European Union deteriorating. And the more relations deteriorated, more closer Turkey became to Russia. And this also has something to do with the domestic politics as well. President Erdogan had several domestic political reasons for being more accommodating to his Russian counterpart, and domestic factors. When I mention domestic factors, one needs to address a specific development, 2016, a coup attempt in Turkey, definitely, and I still believe it still affects Turkey's relations with the United States. Political unwillingness of US and European Union to politically support President Erdogan created a huge trust deficit, still is in play, while Turkey's relations with Russia at that time were diplomatically almost in a lowest level. Still, President Erdogan called for a support. President Putin called for a support to President Erdogan. Having said that, let me also mention a little bit what is the current state of relations, because even though since 2010 or even prior to that, it was suggested or it was asked whether Turkey is shifting from west to east, whether this is a shift in foreign policy. It is hard to say that Turkey's relations with West are replaceable when we consider Turkey's relations with Russia, the nature of it, or let me say, the strengths and weaknesses of bilateral relations between Turkey and Russia. What I'm trying to say is that, yes, those two states, Turkey and Russia, they are led by very assertive leaders who almost enjoy limited political power in their respective countries. But there is also an ongoing nature of relations. Still, we don't talk about strong institutional foundations. While on the other hand, Turkey's relations with the United States, Turkey's relations with the European Union, even though they have been deteriorating for such a long time. Still, we may find out some institutional relations. So rather, when we look at Russia-Turkey relations, what we see is they rely heavily on the personal dialogue between President Putin, President Erdogan, which is unfortunately not that much capable to solve specific problems as we have witnessed during the warplane incident. Even after 2016, even after the coup attempt, when relations with West deteriorated in a very important manner, and Turkey's involvement in Syria also brought very close Turkey to Russia. Even after that, what brought Ankara and Moscow together was not common interests or shared values, but rather necessity of working together. So this is another reason why I believe Turkey's relations with West are not replaceable by Turkey's relations with Russia. As long as we don't talk about common identity, common interest, common threat perceptions, or common idea of common worldview, not only regarding to a region, but in a broader sense, in terms of international system, what I see is, currently, when we look at a picture of Turkey-Russia relations, this is, mostly written. Many analysts have already wrote about this. This is cooperative rivalry. This is adversarial collaboration. What we see is both cooperation and rivalry at the same time, because there are many topics where we do see Turkey-Russia cooperating on the one hand, but also they do support different sides of the conflict in some other cases. The Syria, even though seems for a very long time seemed an area of cooperation, it still includes specific potential crisis, potential risks. Libya is another case where we do see a totally different policies, national interest. Another feature of Turkey-Russia relations is that, as we have seen in case of Nagorno-Karabakh, Ankara-Moscow relations never had a problem-solving capacity, even when the political dialogue was intensive and the connection was very strong during the 2000s. Ukraine has been definitely another area where we have seen diverging interests of Russia and Turkey. And finally, we have seen this, unfortunately, invasion of Russia in Ukraine. Now, traditionally, Turkish foreign policy on Ukraine, it's been a mix of deterrence and a dialogue towards Russia. From the very beginning, Turkey criticized the annexation, never recognized it. It's been vocally criticized by President Erdogan, in a very highest level in different platforms. Potentially, potential hostility between Russia and Ukraine was very unwanted development for Turkey. So therefore, Turkey wanted to play a mediating role, which wasn't possible. 2 weeks ago, prior to the war, Moscow was a little bit critical towards Ankara's position, because I will go in detail that Turkey and Ukraine had a specific cooperation when it comes to defense industry. But in 2 weeks, it seems like at least Prime Minister Lavrov's existence in Ankara, in Antalya Diplomacy Forum, attendance, participation, even though it didn't really brought up specific results, still it gives us a signal that Turkey's position is balanced. At least it didn't up until now harm that much its relations with Russia, but this is a very, very sensitive balance, which we will see how Turkey is going to continue. So from the very beginning, this potential hostility was very unwanted, because, of course, because Turkey-Russia relations, which goes back to early 2000s, they're very complicated. Interdependence is so high, sometimes in economic manner, even though this is in favor of Russia, still Russia is an important regional player, an important political power, looking from Ankara, looking from Turkish foreign policy perspective. Economically, this war, this direct aggression of Russia in Ukraine also brings an important cost for Turkey.
This Eurasianism, the relationship of a Eurasianist vision of Turkish foreign policy to Turkey's foreign policy or strategic identity, these are, of course, topics of relevance, which we have been debating for many years, and we will listen to Suat Bey later, I believe. My own take on that question when it comes to Turkey's strategic identity, personally, I have always emphasized this strategic autonomy quest for strategic autonomy as a defining element of Turkey's foreign conduct, international orientation. So in that sense, when it comes to specific orientations, be it a Western orientation or an Eastern orientation, a Eurasianist orientation, I think still these are secondary to this perception of strategic autonomy, which is deeply shaping the Turkish foreign policy strategic elite. So in that sense, I would argue that both Western orientation and Eurasian orientation in the Turkish context is not much about identity, but it is rather a kind of instrumental element of Turkey's foreign orientation. You remember, for instance, when we used to have these discussions about anti-Americanism, you have this great article. It has been quite a long time now, more than a decade, where you argued that this is not an inbuilt, inherent identity related, but rather it is a kind of political expression of a certain political position. So the anti-Americanism in the Turkish political context. So the Eurasianism is also, I think, similar in the sense that it is not necessarily related to an identity, but it is secondary. So in that sense, we need to rather look at ebbs and flows in Turkey's foreign orientation. So to some extent, Habibe also referred to those changes. To what extent the Turkey-Russia rapprochement in the last decade or 2 decades are instrumental or not, I also think in a similar way. So we have to look at the dynamics of Turkey's relationship with the West and Eurasian context, not in terms of too much identity. I think it in terms of rather conjectural geopolitical, geostrategic changes. So this brings us, of course, to today's discussion, and then especially the fact that we are discussing this interesting topic in the midst of an unfolding major crisis, war, which nobody was hoping to happen, but it did happen. And as many people are arguing now, it is a kind of a wake-up call, a geopolitical wake-up call, and it is forcing many of international actors, stakeholders to confront with some of the essential bare strategic questions which they were and they have been postponing today. And some of these questions were already out there, but many of them, Western powers especially, instead tried to prefer more benign interpretations of the international environment. But since 2014, the discussions about Russian revisionism, what it means, to what extent it can go, and mount a challenge to not only the European security architecture, but also the entire international order. So those questions, big questions, the arguments we have been discussing, the jungle grows back, geopolitics comes back, return of history. So they are not hypothetical anymore. They are a reality. They are shaping the agenda, strategic agenda, and nobody has at this point luxury to escape from that reality. And many of us have awakened to that reality. And now all the discussions about the future will have to be based on this new reality, the unfolding reality, and how different strategic actors will read this unfolding new international environment and will devise their policies accordingly. So in that sense, making a plausible prediction about how things may unfold for Turkey or for other countries is very risky. And then we should really underline it, because things may go in different directions depending on the evolution of the events on the ground, but also the choices of the actors. As we have seen, what's happening in Ukraine, by deciding to invade Ukraine, Russia triggered a lot of counter reactions, counterbalancing dynamics, and it is going to lead to a set of reactions by other actors. And now those reactions also produce their own counter reactions. So in that sense, we are living in this fluid environment. And some people may say we are back to the Cold War. No, it's a containment. So I don't want to name what it is, because it is a transition phase. It's a change of time, altering of times, and then the parameters of this new international security environment and regional environment, and what they mean what they mean for Turkey will be clearer over the next years. So at this point, you ask me, despite all these objections, make some predictions. And here are a couple of observations that I can share. I mean, I think we should put on the table what we know for certain and what we can predict, what we can speculate on. From a Turkish point of view, of course, my assessment will be more related to how I see it. Things may unfold for Turkey in the coming years, in the Eurasian context, perhaps to a certain extent, of course, the Middle Eastern context. As I just said earlier, some of the delayed, postponed strategic questions, they are now on the agenda. The transition of the international system, the US commitment to this neoliberal international orders, the principles underpinning it. So this discussion will be acutely taking place. And then it raises the bigger question, which you also emphasized, as this is the theme which also triggered your project in the first place, the power transition at the global level. So this will also be, I think, more and more visible in our discussions. And as part of this power transition, the so-called great power competition, how the great powers will face each other, how they will confront each other. These will be the dominant themes in the coming years. And for Turkey, what it means. So for Turkey, the way I personally have been always defining Turkey, I see it as a regional power with a desire for regional autonomy. So in that sense, the way I see a regional power is it is a power that sits at the intersection of its own regional context, but also at the global level. So in that sense, it is subject to the pressures, challenges, and opportunities coming from both from within the region, but from the international systemic level as well. So in that sense, I think that transitional phase will be putting big pressures on Turkey, which was also highlighted by Habibe earlier. So in this new phase, what we know, what I can say for Turkey, I think there will be a continuation of some of the themes of Turkey's foreign policy, which were shaping the Turkish foreign policy agenda in the last couple of years. The desire for strategic autonomy will be there. This dualistic attitude toward the West, when it comes to cooperation and competition, when it comes to necessarily challenging or not, it will be definitely there. It won't disappear. You won't see a kind of immediate coming back to the Western fold kind of scenario, which is advocated by some experts, analysts. So Turkey will maintain the same dualistic approach when it comes to West, especially the Western engagement in its own neighborhoods. So this hard power turn, which we were talking about, especially after 2015 or so, and then the normalization agenda in the last 1.5 years, the toning down of certain regional tensions, de-escalation led some people to predict that we have reached the limits and end of the hard power era. Personally, I didn't buy into such arguments, but this new phase, in a sense, retroactively speaking, adds a new justification for the hard power turn in Turkish foreign policy, and I think it will continue to pursue similar hard power related instruments. We will seek to embolden its hard power capacity and will not be hesitant to employ coercive diplomacy and other tools in the coming years. And then when it comes to the relationship between Turkey and Russia, briefly here, and then I will move to my speculations part about China, India. I don't want to go too much details on these questions, Yanis. So with Russia, I guess right now for Turkey, the biggest challenge is to learn, to know, to develop ways to live with a new Russia. It has already been challenging the revisionist Russia, and Turkey has developed its own ways to manage those challenges, and the accommodation, some people may call it differently, but I have been arguing that strategically Turkey made a deliberate policy to some extent, maybe out of necessity, to develop a strategic relationship of dependency on certain contexts. Of course, in certain areas, there was also a challenge to Russia. Turkey did not refrain from confronting in some areas. But in the last several years, after Georgia 2008 and after 2014, Turkey deliberately developed this policy to manage the challenges posed by revisionist or neo-revisionist Russia. But now the reality is different. Russian revisionism has also taken a new turn. And some experts are calling now Russia may go beyond a revisionist power into becoming a kind of rogue state. But in any case, what we can say, irrespective of how the current conflict evolves, we don't know when it may be terminated, under what terms, but the ongoing Western policy, the sanctions policy, their fallout, the secondary sanctions that may go even after the conflict, so on and so forth. So then we see a kind of decaying Russia, which will be a big challenge to Turkey in especially overlapping neighborhoods in the Black Sea, as Habib mentioned, Caucasus and Central Asian context. And we will also see how Russia will react to this decay. As we know from history of great power wars, transitions, declining powers may prefer to retrench. They may maintain their overextension, which may create its own problems. So we don't know. These are big questions, and I think in many ways, one of the big number one strategic challenges for Turkey in coming years is to live with this new Russia.
Let me point out that my paper on Eurasianism, which is hopefully going to come out soon, is primarily focusing more on the domestic dimension of it. I think the Eurasianism discussion was more popular in 2015, 2016, but thanks to the wisdom of President Putin, now the issue, and going into Ukraine, now the issue is back in. Actually, the way the invasion of Ukraine has been covered in the Turkish media, especially how commentators, former generals, some media personalities have been interpreting what is going on the field, has shown quite a bit of a pro-Russian tilt in interpreting events on the ground. And this actually has confirmed my findings in my report, that I believe Russia has very smartly invested in social media, traditional media personalities. Sputnik Turkey has 1 million followers in Turkey and is now banned in many countries, but continues to influence the Turkish debate. I wouldn't call it only Euro-Asianist, but you see pro-Chinese, pro-Russian tendencies. Of course, the ELIMED group, which is the sort of most well-known Euro-Asianist actor in the domestic setting. Of course, the Vatan Party, Mr. Perinçek and his party. It's not a homogeneous group of people. It's actually, I classify Turkey's Euro-Asianists as a subgroup of the Ulusalcıs, which is these leftist, patriotic or nationalist larger group that is actually disseminated both in a large segment of Turkish electorate, including the CHP, MHP, and maybe others, of whom many describe themselves as Ulusalcı. And I think the Euro-Asianists are a subgroup of that, a smaller group for sure. That said, my findings found that especially in the immediate aftermath of the release of the Ergenekon and Balyoz trial, people, including many former military personalities, I think Euro-Asianism was quite popular as they just got out of prison and were re-energized by coming back into the Turkish political scene. Of course, then Mr. Perinçek's unofficial part in the ruling coalition, the media group's position on Turkish domestic politics confirmed their unofficial coalition partner status within Turkey. But of course, there are many other groups that we define as Eurasian. It's not only limited to the Vatan Party or Aydınlık group. There are also, to lesser degrees, other groups which I have outlined in my report. But what needs to be registered for our discussion today is, in my view, Russia and China obviously are very cognizant of Turkey's strategic value, of the geostrategic value of the geography itself. As Shaban said, in Davutoğlu terminology, Turkey is at the intersecting, Turkey is intersecting a number of regions, the Balkans, the Black Sea, the Caucasus, the Eastern Mediterranean. And there is no doubt that both China and Russia invested in the last decade, if not more, in in influencing the Turkish public debate. And the deterioration of relations between Turkey and the United States, especially around the coup attempt in 2016, and as well the perception that the United States is aiding the PKK, PYD, YPG in northern Syria has obviously had a huge impact on the domestic perception towards the United States.